Imagine that you're Ukraine and you're preparing a strike on Crimea. Do you hit an oil depot? Taking out more Russian oil means less fuel for Vladimir Putin's troops. What about trains? Russia relies heavily on rail for all its freight and passenger traffic, so trains are always valuable targets. Or what about striking Russian logistics to prevent the country from leveraging Crimea to hurt Ukraine? Decisions, decisions, decisions. Well, how about a little bit of everything instead? That's what Ukraine hit over the weekend as it unleashed a firestorm that devoured Crimea. Putin is powerless to stop Ukraine's asymmetric assault, and his Crimean war machine is crumbling as a result. On November 7, the Kyiv Independent was among several outlets to report on a wide-ranging series of strikes that Ukraine conducted against the Russian occupiers in Crimea. Overseen by Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, or SSO, these strikes involved the use of long-range drones to hit a major oil depot, some trains, and logistical facilities throughout the Annexed Peninsula. The SSO took to Telegram to declare, "SSO burns down enemy oil depots in temporarily occupied Crimea," and the SSO provided a full roundup. First, we head to the Hvardiiske Oil Depot, located near a village with a similar name. As the SSO states, SSO drones struck the Hvardiiske Oil Depot near the village of Hvardiiske in the temporarily occupied territory of Crimea. An RVS 400 tank was destroyed. At the time of the strike, it was full. A few more details come from the Kyiv Independent, which says that Hvardiiske is also just 20 kilometers, or about 12.4 miles, away from the major Crimean hub of Simferopol. Ukraine reportedly took aim at an RVS 400 tank that is designed to hold several types of oil-related products, including crude oil and petroleum. That tank is no more. The SSO's drones have turned it into a flaming wreckage. The explosions at the oil depot were loud enough that residents in Simferopol were able to hear them, United 24 media reports in its roundup of Ukraine's Crimea strikes. The drones also struck during the early hours of the morning, with the first explosions being heard at 2:17 a.m. local time. A fire soon broke out at the oil depot. A handful of extra details come from the Crimean Wind Telegram channel, which also reported on Ukraine's depot destruction. It claims that the SSO didn't just use drones in its strike, it also used missiles. After an initial flurry of drones that was seen taking flight at around 1 a.m. and arrived in Crimea about an hour later, Ukraine unleashed a volley of missiles, 4 of which the channel says were sent toward the village that plays host to the now flaming oil depot. Around 3 a.m, 4 missiles were reported from Hvardiiske, with smoke rising over the village. It's unknown whether they hit the airfield or the oil depot, Crimean Wind says. The oil depot seems the most likely target. At the time of creating this video, there is no word on an airfield strike. United 24 media adds that the same Telegram channel has shared a couple of videos that purport to show the strike. The first of these videos seem to be shot from a window in Simferopol. We see the city itself, with nothing remarkable immediately catching the eye. However, if you look over to the horizon and slightly to the left, there is a strange light burning in the background. That appears to be the old depot that Ukraine hit, and the flames were large enough to be seen several miles away. A second video is also shared, though we see nothing but murky blackness in this footage. However, there is a clear sound of missiles or drones flying in the background, suggesting that this video was also taken during the depot destruction. And Ukraine was far from done. As the oil depot burned in Hvardiiske, Ukraine's other drones had a different kind of prey in their sights: Russia's trains. A pair of them were destroyed during the November 5 and 6 drone assault. Militani reports both had wagons loaded with petroleum products. The trains were at a loading-unloading site, though it's unclear if the wagons were being filled or emptied. It doesn't really matter. With those trains destroyed, gasoline and diesel intended for Russian soldiers on the front aren't going to get to where they need to be. Plus, Russia now knows that Ukraine's drones can reach a loading station that Russia likely thought was safe. The 2 trains were close to the oil depot that Ukraine targeted, Ukrinform adds in its November 7 report. And if Russia had any designs on claiming that these strikes didn't happen, the SSO is 2 steps ahead. It's released footage shot from the perspective of its drones to demonstrate that Ukraine scored direct hits. The video, which can be watched on YouTube, appears to cover the full gamut of Ukraine strikes. It opens with one of Ukraine's drones scoring a direct hit on what appears to be a massive oil tanker before switching to the trains. One drone records itself smashing into the side of one of the Russian trains, as the videos interspersed with other footage showing flames rising into the skies. Ukraine hit Russia hard, and there was nothing that Putin could do to stop it. And then there were the fuel bases. After taking out the oil depot and the trains that Russia uses to transport fuel around Crimea, Ukraine turned its sights onto several fuel bases located around the Crimean peninsula. New Skies has the details in its November 7 report, noting that Ukraine struck fuel bases in Simferopol and Bitumne. The SSO confirms this in its Telegram post, stating, SSO drones also struck several oil depots and fuel and lubricants warehouses in Simferopol and the surrounding area, the village of Bitumne. Tank park facilities were destroyed, numerous fires were recorded. Now, there's a mention of a tank park in that statement. Perhaps Ukraine hit more than we realize on the night of November 5 into November 6. Regardless, there are no other details provided about the fuel-based strikes, other than fires being recorded throughout Crimea. That suggests either direct hits, or as Russia so often likes to claim, Ukrainian drone debris falling out of the sky and setting Russian fuel on fire. Ukraine won't care which of the two it is. Every litre of petroleum snatched away from Russia is a litre that Putin's forces can't use in their assaults against Ukraine. All in all, November 5 to November 6 was a pretty productive night for Ukraine. Multiple military essential sites in Crimea are now burning, and we see a clever layered approach to Ukraine strikes. It's taken out a depot used to store vast quantities of Russian oil and fuel. It's also hit several fuel bases, which likely helped to disseminate that fuel around Crimea. And by taking out a pair of trains, Ukraine has also ensured that fuel that's already been loaded, or was due to be loaded, doesn't get to where it needs to go. It's all part of a Ukrainian strategy designed to create as much disruption in the Russian rear as possible, which leads to weaker Russian assaults on the front lines. Now, we'll dig deeper into why all of this matters in a moment. For now, you'd have to imagine that Russia would be raging about these Crimean strikes. However, as is so often the case, the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't have a lot to say about what Ukraine just accomplished. That's according to United 24 Media, which says that the Russian authorities have yet to release an official statement about the events. The Crimean Wind Telegram channel contradicts that statement somewhat, as it says, by the way, the Russian Ministry of Lies reports that 7 drones were allegedly shot down over Crimea last night. That's normal for Russia's defense ministry. It focuses on its supposed successes while Ukraine's targets burn. We know about 2. One was shot down near the oil depot in Simferopol, the second by something flammable in Hvardiiske. Crimean Wind adds before asking, where are the other 5? Russia isn't going to answer that question, which suggests that the Russian Defense Ministry is once again playing fast and loose with the truth of what happened in Crimea. There's enough footage out there already to prove that Ukraine has taken out the targets the SSO claims it hit, and Russia's claims of shooting 7 drones down aren't going to change that fact. All of this brings us to a question. What does Ukraine hope to achieve with strikes like these? We've touched on a couple of potential answers already when it comes to the weakening of Russia's forces and the destruction of Russian logistics. Fuel and trains have both seen major targets for Ukraine over the last few months. As New Skies puts it, the strikes on fuel reserves and railway tanks in Crimea have 2 strategic objectives: to limit the mobility of Russian troops, to deprive the army of reserves, and to disrupt the logistics of offensive operations. Experts emphasize that these strikes are not random, but are elements of a comprehensive campaign to paralyze occupation logistics. However, it goes a little deeper than that. Ukraine's strikes on Crimea's fuel reserves come at a time when the occupied peninsula is feeling the effects of Ukraine's attacks on Russia's oil refineries in a major way. Starting with fuel, the Kyiv Independent highlighted some of the problems Crimea's been dealing with in recent months. On October 8, it reported that Russia had expanded gasoline sale restrictions across several territories as a response to Ukrainian drone strikes taking a large portion of Russia's oil refinery capacity offline. Refining is the process used to turn crude oil into usable products, such as gasoline and diesel, meaning Ukraine's strikes did precisely what they were designed to do: take a massive bite out of Russia's fuel reserves. Crimea was already struggling with severe fuel shortages when these measures were announced, the outlet says. Around half of the peninsula's gas stations had been forced to halt their sales by September 24, amidst Ukraine repeatedly hitting 16 of Russia's 38 oil refineries. Fast forward to the end of October, and the situation was a touch brighter for the unfortunate residents of Crimea. On October 28, the Moscow Times reported that the peninsula's authorities had increased the limit on the amount of fuel each individual could purchase during a visit to a gas station. Crimea's Russian residents couldn't get too excited though. They were still only allowed to buy 30 litres per person, which amounts to about 6.5 gallons. That's a slight improvement on the 20-litre limit that was in place before, though it's still only just about enough to fill half a tank for a small car. It's not like Crimea's people are suddenly swimming in gasoline. They're just dealing with slightly eased restrictions. Perhaps losing so much fuel between the nights of November 5 and 6 will end up making those restrictions harsher again. These types of shortages are all part of the Ukrainian plan, and its refinery strikes are going to have a long-lasting impact. That's according to the Atlantic Council, which wrote the following in October. In a recent assessment, the Paris-based International Energy Agency stated that the impact from Ukrainian drone strikes is expected to suppress refinery processing rates for Russia's economically crucial oil industry until at least mid-2026. The outlet added that Ukraine's refinery strikes continue to gain pace, and now, as we see from these November strikes, Ukraine isn't just taking aim at the facilities responsible for making gasoline, it's taking out the fuel that Russia has stored. Depots, trains, and fuel bases are all in the crosshairs in what amounts to be a multi-layered approach to putting the squeeze on Russia's people. And Putin is being forced to make choices. Does he send Russia's dwindling supplies of fuel to the front lines, thus depriving the country's people of a vital resource they need to live and work? Or does he keep the domestic situation as strong as possible, while weakening his soldiers and their assaults against Ukraine's defenses? Neither is a good choice. The first leads to angry citizens at home, and the second results in more dead Russians in Ukraine for very little territorial gain. All of this is without mentioning the impact on the Russian economy. As the Atlantic Council notes, Russia is trying to reduce its reliance on the taxes it generates from oil and gas sales. It has to. The combination of Ukraine's refinery strikes and Western sanctions means that Russia has less fuel to sell, and it's making far too little from it. What is Russia's grand idea for solving this problem? Implementing more domestic taxes on its people, the Atlantic Council reports. These are taxes that will be implemented on a population that's dealing with inflation that hasn't dropped below 8% in a single month between September 2024 and September 2025. More taxes, as the cost of living rises and fuel is in short supply, will only frustrate Russian people who are being hurt far more than they ever expected by Putin's short-sighted special military operation in Ukraine. The Ukrainian strategy is all about creating pressure. Crimea's people will be feeling the squeeze even more after these latest attacks, and Putin is running out of excuses that he can deliver. All of this is compounded by Ukraine also turning its attention to Russia's vast train network. Another 2 of Russia's trains have been destroyed in Crimea, and these are the latest victims of a concerted strategy that is seeing Ukraine take out as much of Russia's rail-based freight as it can. The Moscow Times anticipated the creation of this strategy in a June 12 piece, in which it pointed out that Russia's railways are both vital to the country's war effort and difficult to take offline. Its report came as Ukraine had just launched an underwater drone attack on the Kerch Bridge that serves Crimea and is home to a massive freight railway line. That attack didn't take the Kerch Bridge out permanently, but it served as a signal of Ukraine's intent in 2025. The outlet highlights just how important railways are to Russia by noting that the chairman of the board of Russia's largest railway company, creatively named Russian Railways, is Andrei Belousov. If that name is ringing some bells, that's because Belousov also happens to be Russia's defense minister. After what just happened in Crimea, Belousov will be simultaneously trying to hide Ukraine's success while dealing with 2 more of Russia's locomotives getting burnt to ash. This connection between rail and Russian defense tells you everything that you need to know about how much Russia relies on the proper functioning of its trains and rail network to keep its Ukraine war machine churning. In fact, part of Russia's strategy in the war has been to take control of Ukraine's railway hubs so they can use them to send more troops and supplies into Ukraine. Without rails, Russia's logistics turn to dust. Ukraine knows this, meaning the Crimea strike achieved the dual purpose of taking out fuel and delivering a jab to Russia's logistical network on the peninsula. By November 2, United 24 media was reporting that Ukraine is also leveraging the capabilities of partisan groups to conduct sabotage operations on Russian trains. Many of these groups operate inside Russia itself, the outlet points out, and they appear to be operating under the guidance of Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence. So, Russia's trains are a target, and Ukraine is using a combination of drones and ground-based saboteurs to destroy as many Russian locomotives as possible. This is a microcosm of the asymmetric assault that's characterized Ukraine's approach to its defense against Russia. Putin seems incapable of countering these tactics, even though Ukraine has been deploying them from the moment that Russia invaded. This asymmetric assault has been expanded in recent months. As News Sky notes, SSR operations demonstrate a new approach to war. Strikes on enemy rear bases, the use of drones for pinpoint attacks on reserves, creating instability and increasing the blackout effect for army logistics. The war in Crimea has long since turned into a front against energy infrastructure. And this is the key point. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he expected nothing more than a traditional war. Ukraine might try to fight back, he thought, but Russia had the numbers advantage in every arena. More soldiers, planes, tanks and armored vehicles would win the day. Even when Ukraine unexpectedly pushed Russia's forces back and Ukraine's Western allies started sending equipment to the country, Putin thought it would only be a matter of time. A war of attrition it would be. The numerical advantage would still count, even if the victory took longer to achieve. What Putin never anticipated was that Ukraine was too smart to drag itself solely into a straight fight with Russia. The advent of drones on the battlefield came early, and Ukraine's constant evolution of what was once an underused military technology has allowed it to take an asymmetric approach that's hitting Russia in places it never expected to be hit. As the Geneva Center for Security Policy noted in March, Ukraine has redefined how to conduct a war against a Goliath of a nation when you're cast in the role of David. The superior numbers of ships, tanks and aircraft Russia can deploy are now far less meaningful than the ability to use everything from drones to smartphones to deal damage to an enemy. Open source technology and cost-effective artificial intelligence are also feeding into Ukraine's asymmetrical approach, allowing it to hit targets in the Russian deep rear and on Russian territory that Putin would have assumed would be safe when he first invaded Ukraine. Ukraine's strikes on Crimea offer the perfect example. While a handful of missiles may have been involved on the night of November 5, it seems that the majority of the damage done came as a result of Ukraine's drones. These cheap devices, at least in comparison to traditional military hardware, are accurate, difficult to stop, and can be deployed in such numbers that they can swarm a target. As the Modern War Institute notes in an October piece, this conflict has exposed the excessive cost of outdated doctrines, vulnerable legacy systems, and rigid command structures. Ukraine is succeeding against Russia because it's always adapting to whatever Russia throws at it. Now, its asymmetric strategy is focused on the fuel that Russia's tanks, vehicles, and people need to survive. What we're seeing is still a war of attrition. However, it's attrition that's less to do with the amount of traditional military hardware a nation can field and more to do with how much of the enemy's resources can be destroyed outside of Ukraine's borders or in its occupied territory. Crimea is a target that's become increasingly easy for Ukraine to hit as the war has progressed. The odds are that we'll be reporting on yet more Crimean fuel, oil and equipment being destroyed by Ukraine's drones sooner rather than later. By the way, we touched on Ukraine leveraging partisan groups to destroy Russian trains as part of its asymmetric strategy. It did just that toward the end of last week, and it used Russian saboteurs who have betrayed Putin in the process. Russia is dealing with a fight from within as Russians are working against Putin to cripple the country from the inside. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering Ukraine's latest strikes against occupied Crimea.